This is lecture 2 for biology 178, covering spinal nerves and spinal reflexes. We'll start our discussion with spinal nerves, talking about dermatomes. A dermatome refers to a specific bilateral region of the skin surface that is monitored by a single pair of spinal nerves. If you remember in our previous lecture, we actually covered all the different 31 pairs of spinal nerves that extend out from the spinal cord. Each one of those pairs of nerves is going to monitor a region of skin. Now, the boundaries of these adjacent dermatomes overlap, and these are clinically important because they help to determine the extent of damage or infection of the spinal nerve or dorsal root ganglion. A loss of sensation or characteristic signs that appear on the skin of that dermatome can indicate this. So here's a diagram of the different regions of the skin that are monitored by the different spinal nerves. You do not need to memorize this for any sort of exam, but this is a reference to show you the different areas and how they correspond to those different spinal nerves. Now, in certain spinal segments that control the skeletal muscles of the neck and upper or lower limbs, the ventral rami of adjacent spinal nerves combine to mix fibers and give rise to a network of compound nerve trunks called a plexus, which is a complex interwoven network of nerves. These form during development. The small muscles are innervated by different ventral rami, and they fuse to form those larger muscles. And the muscles will fuse to form larger muscles with compound origins, but separate ventral rami. The ventral rami of adjacent spinal nerves will converge and blend to produce those different plexuses. Here we can see a sample of a plexus and how the different roots will combine together and merge out from there. We're going to talk about some of the different plexuses and some of the major nerves that correspond to each plexus. Now, there are 4 major plexuses, and we typically combine the last plexus to the last 2 plexuses together. They are the cervical plexus, which is going to be in the neck and upper head, the brachial plexus, which would extend down the arms and through the shoulder region, and the lumbar and sacral plexuses, referred to commonly as the lumbosacral plexus. And this is actually going to innervate a lot of the lower body and hip regions. Here we can actually see a diagram of the different plexuses. The cervical plexus is going to be nerve roots C1 through C5. The brachial nerve plexus will be C5 through T1. And the lumbosacral plexus is going to be lumbar T12 through L4 and sacral L4 through S4. And we can see all of the different nerves that branch off from these regions. The first of the nerve plexuses that we'll talk about is the cervical nerve plexus. It innervates the neck, upper torso, and diaphragm, as can be seen here, and the roots of the cervical nerve plexus extend from C1 to C5. One of the major nerves that actually is going to be part of the cervical nerve plexus is the phrenic nerve, shown here in bold. The phrenic nerve is actually a nerve that extends out from C4 through C5 and is going to innervate directly with the diaphragm and be responsible for controlling your rate of breath and depth of breath. So it's going to help you actually breathe. Moving down from the cervical plexus, we have the brachial nerve plexus. This is a larger and more complex network of nerves, and it innervates the pectoral girdle and upper limb. Its nerve roots extend from C5 through T1. Some of the major nerves here are the radial and ulnar nerves that extend on the lateral and medial aspects of the arm, as well as other nerves of the arm, neck, and upper torso. Here we can see the brachial plexus as it extends off from C5 through T1, namely some of the other nerves that branch off towards the upper shoulder and into the pectoral girdle, things like the subscapular nerve, the pectoral nerve, and the axillary nerve. These are all going to branch off to different parts of the shoulder complex and some of the different muscles and regions here. Following the actual shoulder region that extends down from the brachial nerve plexus will be the radial ulnar, and median nerves. These extend the entire length of the arm and all the way down to the hand where they innervate. Here we can actually see a diagram of where these nerves actually innervate on the hand directly. The radial nerve is going to be, of course, more on the radial side. It's going to innervate the dorsal portion of the hand with the thumb, and the median nerve is going to innervate more of the palmar surface towards the thumb. The ulnar will go the entire medial side and is going to be a little bit more of the pinky on both the front, on the palmar and dorsal regions of the hand. Our final two plexuses are the lumbar and sacral plexus, and they are actually going to combine to form the lumbosacral plexus. Here we can see the lumbar plexus from nerve roots T12 through L4, and the sacral plexus, nerve roots L4 through S4. This is actually these two plexuses are going to innervate the abdominal muscles, the upper leg muscles, and the skin of the external genitalia. Some of the major nerves of the lumbosacral plexus include the femoral nerve, which would innervate the anterior muscles of the leg, the gentiofemoral nerve, which is actually going to innervate some of the groin region as well as the genitals, and then the sciatic nerve that we can see here that extends the entire length of the posterior aspect of the leg and runs just deep to the gluteus maximus and minimus muscles. Additional nerves here are going to be the pudendal nerve, which innervates the anal and urethral sphincters as well as the skin of the external genitalia. It's common to have a condition called a sciatica for people that have bulging discs or any sort of back issues. Oftentimes, this is going to be a intervertebral disc from the vertebral column that would pinch off portions of this sacral nerve, causing pain to radiate throughout the entire leg. Moving on from nerves, we'll now talk about reflexes and some of the actions that happen throughout the spinal cord. A reflex is a rapid automatic response to a specific stimuli. They are in place in order to preserve homeostasis by making rapid adjustments in the organ or organ system function without having to actually go up to the central nervous system and have a longer integration time. They have very little variability in response. Typically, if A happens, then B will be the response, and it always goes that way. In some cases, we can create a little bit of variability, but that tends to slow down the reflex. The overall process of a reflex occurring is called a reflex arc. Here, sensory fibers will deliver information from the peripheral receptors to an integration center in the central nervous system. The motor fibers from the central nervous system will then carry those motor commands out to the peripheral effectors, either a gland or muscle. This is often an example of negative feedback. One of the best examples is, of course, pulling a hand away from a painful stimulus. If you touch a hot stove, you are pulling it away. So the action is in the opposite direction of the stimulus. We'll now be covering the different steps of a reflex arc. The first step is the activation of a receptor by arriving stimulus. In this case, it's going to be a painful nail. I put my hand on the nail. Stimulus. From there, that stimulus will activate a sensory neuron. This is the afferent signal that will travel to the spinal cord through the dorsal root ganglion, the dorsal root, and into the posterior gray horn. From here, we have integration, which is step 3. It's going to go into the central nervous system, and in this case, it's going to visit an interneuron. The interneuron is going to branch off the connection, so it will send some information to the brain and the higher centers, and the other information out via an efferent signal. Step 4 is the activation of a motor neuron via the efferent signal that was sent out from the spinal cord. This will then travel through the ventral root to the motor neuron and activate an effector. Step 5, the response of the peripheral effector that is stimulated by that motor neuron. And this will activate the skeletal muscle, which will issue a response. In this case, moving your hand away from the painful stimulus. Now, what we just covered in the previous slide is a general reflex arc. All reflexes follow the general blueprint of that event. So there's going to be a stimulus, There's going to be an afferent nerve fiber. There's going to be some sort of connection in the central nervous system, an activation of an efferent fiber, and then the activation of the effector. But we can classify reflexes into different ways. We can classify them by development, the nature of the response, the complexity of the circuit, and the processing site. And so all reflexes can fall under these. And it's important to remember that these are not mutually exclusive. We can be innate, visceral, polysynaptic, and cranial. We can be all of these things, or we can have each one of these classifications as we go down. I'm now going to go through the next series of slides, which is going to break down each one of these classifications and give you some examples. Our first reflex classification is development. This is about how we develop this reflex. If it is innate, that means we are born with it. Innate reflexes result from connections formed during development. They are genetically or developmentally programmed. Some are very simple, like the withdrawal from pain. Everyone is born with that. Some are a bit more complex, things like chewing or the tracking of the object with the eyes. We develop these over time, but it is innate in nature and a little bit more complex. Acquired reflexes or conditioned reflexes are something that we learn. They are rapid and automated, but they are learned and not pre-established. They are enhanced by repetition. Examples of these could be reflexes that you learn while driving. If somebody comes over to your lane, you immediately jerk right. And so you understand how to actually perform that. Different reflexes for gaming. It's what makes people faster the more they do play certain video games. They know how to actually respond. If they see enemy fire coming at them, they strafe to the other direction. There's different sporting reflexes. If a ball is coming your way, you immediately know to stick up your hand and catch it. That catch reflex is actually something that is learned. It's not something that you're born with. In the second classification, we have the nature of the motor response. This can either be somatic or visceral. Somatic reflexes deal with the body, and they provide for involuntary control of skeletal muscles. An example of this, of course, is the withdrawal reflex. We are going to use our skeletal muscles in a rapid, reflexive manner to withdraw ourselves from pain. This is essential for survival because they are immediate and they don't require processing time. Visceral reflexes are otherwise known as autonomic reflexes. Here, we control or adjust the activities of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, and adipose tissue. So we're dealing with the organs. An example could be the baroreceptor reflex. This is actually controlling blood pressure. So if pressure ever gets too high, we can relax or dilate our blood vessels to lower the blood pressure. Or an example could be the feed-forward reflex. The feed-forward reflex is actually going to be anticipating something in advance. So an example of that would be you smell delicious food, so you start salivating. The next reflex classification is complexity of the circuit. And this one really only breaks down into if it's one, monosynaptic, or many, polysynaptic. We'll start with monosynaptic. This is the simplest reflex arc and involves only one synapse between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. So there's minimal delay between stimulus and response. There is no interneuron in this reflex arc. The best example we have of this is the myotactic or stretch reflex. So when the doctor is going to take the little rubber mallet and hit your knee tendon and you kick, that would be an example of the myotactic monosynaptic reflex arc. A polysynaptic reflex simply means that there's going to be at least one interneuron. There's more than one connection. These typically have a longer delay between stimulus and response because the more synapses that there are, the longer that the delay is going to be. And this means a polysynaptic reflex can produce a complicated response and activate many muscle groups, as we'll see with the crossed extensor reflex. Finally, we can classify reflexes by processing site. Are they processed in the spine or the cranial, in the brain? Spinal reflexes are interconnections and processing events that occur in the nuclei of the spinal cord. They are simple segmental reflexes that involve a single segment. Intersegmental reflexes involve multiple segments of the spinal cord and produce complex coordinated responses. A good example of this is the crossed extensor reflex. This is going to be where you might step on a nail. And in this case, you would have to withdraw your foot from the nail, engage the muscles of your other leg to balance, and you might be engaging the muscles of your arms to be able to stick out or grab hold of something to properly balance now that you're on one leg. So you can see you're using multiple parts of the spinal cord in this intersegmental reflex. A cranial reflex would be interconnections and processing events occurring in the nuclei of the brain. This might deal with different sorts of eye or neck reflexes primarily. We're now going to start through different examples of specific reflexes. The first reflex we'll cover is probably one of the best known monosynaptic reflexes, the stretch reflex or the myotactic reflex. This automatically regulates skeletal muscle length. It is a reason why we can actually produce power as well with this stretch reflex and use the elastic potential of our muscles. An example of the myotactic reflex that we talked about already is the patellar reflex. The stimulus equals increasing muscle length, and then the sensory neuron triggers an immediate motor response to contract that skeletal muscle. The entire reflex is completed within 20 to 40 milliseconds. So this is taking you through an example reflex arc of the stretch reflex. Here we have an increase in stretch that activates a muscle spindle. This is going to be our sensory receptor that we'll talk about in a bit. The activated muscle spindle will travel via the afferent pathway to the spinal cord. There is no interneuron in this reflex arc. That information is going to then activate an efferent motor neuron, which will activate the effector muscle to contract, thus protecting the muscle from stretching too much. Now, I mentioned previously that the increased stretch is detected by what is called a muscle spindle. A muscle spindle is a sensory receptor involved in the stretch reflex that is present in all skeletal muscle. It consists of bundles of small, specialized skeletal muscle fibers called intrafusal fibers. These are embedded throughout the skeletal muscle. Muscle spindles are surrounded by larger skeletal muscle fibers responsible for resting muscle tone and for contraction of the entire muscle. To actually innervating these muscle spindles are gamma motor neurons. These control the sensitivity of the muscle spindles by altering the tension in the intrafusal fibers. They allow the central nervous system to increase or decrease muscle tone. Here we can see an example of these intrafusal fibers. We have a sensory neuron that is carrying information to the central nervous system, and that gamma motor neuron that would innervate these intrafusal fibers to create resting tone. So this is why different muscles are different levels of tightness in your body, is because of the gamma motor neuron. Now, when we actually have a resting length of skeletal muscle, we have an action potential frequency in the sensory neuron that is normal. So for this reason, normal tone would persist. Now let's stretch that muscle. So if we stretch the muscle, we increase the action potential frequency in the muscle spindle. Thus, muscle tone will increase. We're trying to contract it to prevent the muscle from overstretching and potentially tearing. But we go on the flip side and we contract the muscle. If we contract the muscle, we have a decreased action potential frequency in that sensory neuron, the muscle spindle. And thus, muscle tone will decrease. So it's not, we might be contracting it to forcefully increase muscle tone, but we're actually going to be turning off the gamma motor neuron in this case because it doesn't need to have as much involuntary muscle tone at this time because you're producing it voluntarily. Underneath the stretch reflex, besides just the myotactic reflex, we have postural reflexes. Postural reflexes help us to maintain a normal upright position. An example of this is simply standing. If you're standing up, many muscle groups are working in opposition of one another to maintain balance of your body over the feet. Leaning forward stimulates stretch receptors in the calf muscles. They respond by contracting to pull you back upright. Most postural muscle adjustments are unconscious. We don't even realize that we're doing them. But over time, we might need to focus a little bit more on them as we get older because many of these pathways and muscle systems become degraded with limited use. Moving on to other reflexes, we'll talk about the withdrawal reflex. This is a very well-known reflex arc that moves the affected body part away from a given stimulus. It is the strongest types of withdrawal reflexes are triggered by painful stimuli. Sometimes it is initiated by a stimulus from touch or pressure receptors. So if we feel something that we didn't expect, we might withdraw without even the presence of pain. It is a very versatile set of reflexes because the sensory neurons activate many pools of interneurons. The distribution and effects and strength of these responses is dependent upon the intensity of the stimulus and location. The first would be the flexor reflex. This is one of the simplest types of withdrawal reflexes. Here, a painful stimulus is initiated and we withdraw our hand or foot. An example would be grabbing a hot pan on the stove. Here, the pain receptors are stimulated and sensory neurons activate interneurons in the spinal cord to transmit information. The interneurons stimulate the motor neurons in the anterior gray horns, resulting in contraction of the flexor muscles to yank the hand away. And they also are going to keep the extensors relaxed. This concept is called reciprocal inhibition. Here we can see that withdrawal reflex of grabbing the hot pan on the stove. So the person is going to grab the hot pan and initiate a stimulus that will travel via the sensory or afferent neuron to the dorsal root ganglion through the dorsal root and into the posterior gray horn. Once in the posterior gray horn, it's going to innervate with an interneuron. The interneuron is going to send some information up the spinal cord to other segments or to the brain for processing, and then it's going to hit two types of motor neurons, or two motor neurons rather. One is going to be turned on, where it's going to activate the flexors. So it's activating your bicep muscles to flex the elbow and bring the hand away. The other motor neuron is actually going to inhibit the actions of the tricep. By inhibiting the actions of the tricep, I ensure that the flexors will activate and I'll have a faster overall reaction. This concept of turning one side on and turning the other one off is called reciprocal inhibition. Expanding upon the withdrawal reflex is the crossed extensor reflex. I've mentioned this once before. Now, stretch reflexes and withdrawal reflexes typically involve ipsilateral reflex arcs. Ipsilateral means the same side. So that means that the sensory stimulus and motor response are on the same side. If my right hand goes to grab the hot pan, it is my right hand that will move away from the pan, and all of that movement will take place on that side. A crossed extensor reflex, however, involves a contralateral reflex arc, meaning there will be things that will occur on the opposite side. So in this case, an additional motor response occurs on the opposite side of the stimulus. So if I step on something with my right foot, my left foot will also engage and have a reflexive response. So if I step on a tack, the flexors will actually pull my affected foot away from the ground. Interneurons stimulated in the spinal cord will stimulate the flexors of that leg and inhibit the extensors. Now, from there, the crossed extensor reflex will occur simultaneously, activating stimulating the different extensors and inhibiting the different flexor muscles of the opposing leg. This results in straightening the opposite leg and pulling the affected leg away. So here we can actually see that crossed extensor reflex in action. I have a painful stimulus where I step on a tack. That's going to activate the afferent neurons, go into the posterior gray horn to innervate with the interneuron. The interneuron is going to form a multitude of connections. It will activate the affected foot, in this case the right foot, the foot that the person is stepping on the tack with. It's going to activate the flexors and inhibit the extensors in order to pull the foot away. To maintain balance, it is going to, on the opposite leg, the left leg in this case, It is going to stimulate the extensors and inhibit the flexors to ensure proper balance. Additionally, information could travel up the spinal cord and it could cause you to immediately splay your arms out in order to balance with your arms. Additional stretch reflexes that can be done throughout the body are going to be the biceps, triceps, and ankle jerk reflex. These are going to be very much the same as the knee jerk reflex. Here, we're simply going to tap the tendon to stretch the muscle and cause it to go back, to contract back. The reflex responses provide information about the status of the corresponding spinal segments, much like a dermatome. Another test would be the Babinski test. The Babinski test is actually going to be stroking the foot on the lateral side of the sole. In infants, this causes the extension of the big toe and the fanning of the toes. This is a positive result and very normal in infants. However, it does disappear as descending motor pathways begin to develop and we have more voluntary control of our lower limbs. In adults, a normal response is a curling of the toes or no movement of the toes. This could also be known as plantar flexion, where we actually point the toes out, curl the toes, etc. And this is a negative result. The negative result is normal in most adults. If the response is positive, however, this may indicate damage to the higher centers or descending tracts of the nervous system. The reflex is often tested when a CNS injury is suspected. Now, although spinal reflexes usually occur without any involvement of the brain can exert influence over many spinal reflexes. Our first example of this is reinforcement. Reinforcement has the pathways indirectly enforce the reflex by causing a nervous system distraction. For example, in the gymnastic maneuver, the subject hooks their hands together and tries to pull them apart, all while the physician is going to tap the patella. It usually elicits a greater patellar reflex, so a stronger kick. This is because the distraction prevented the subject from consciously inhibiting any of that kick response by tightening the opposing leg muscles. It produces greater overall response. Another way that the brain can influence spinal reflexes is through inhibition. In inhibition, inhibitory neurons synapse on the postsynaptic motor neuron. Activation of the inhibitory neurons from the brain will stop action potential signals. So a good example of this could be you consciously override the pain reflex if you're trying to pull a loved one from a burning vehicle, or you know it's going to hurt, but you're not going to withdraw yourself from the pain because you care so much about trying to accomplish that task at hand. So reinforcement and inhibition. We're going to finish up this nervous system lecture giving you a brief overview of the autonomic nervous system. Now, unlike the somatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system controls body functions that we have very little awareness of and almost no conscious control over. These would be things like respiration, heart rate, and blood pressure. The integrative center is in the hypothalamus, and the visceral motor or autonomic signals are carried via autonomic nuclei in the brainstem or spinal cord. We have two major divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system is known as your fight or flight system and is largely responsible for autonomic responses that prepare the body to deal with emergency. This is going to release norepinephrine or epinephrine onto target cells. The responses of the activation of sympathetic neurons or the sympathetic nervous system are heightened mental alertness, so you become more aware of what's going on, an increased metabolic rate, where your body is going to be running hotter and faster. It's going to decrease digestive and urinary functions because they're not important when dealing with this response. It has a mobilization of energy reserves, both glucose in the body, glycogen is going to be broken down into glucose and released into the bloodstream, and fat cells are actually going to start going through the breakdown process and conversion into sugars. Dilation of respiratory passageways and an increased respiratory rate. This way you can breathe more easily and get oxygen more quickly to facilitate the energy usage. Increased heart rate and blood pressure, so your body can start pumping faster. And the activation of sweat glands. Since your body is heating up, you need to be able to cool it down as well. Parasympathetic is the opposite of sympathetic nervous system. It is called the rest and digest or the rest and repose system. It functions to conserve energy and promote sedentary activities like digestion. It's going to primarily use acetylcholine on target cells. The responses of increased parasympathetic activation are decreased metabolic rate, slow things down, decreased heart rate and blood pressure, increased secretion by salivary and digestive glands to promote digestion, increased motility in blood flow to the digestive tract to improve rate of digestion and absorption of nutrients, the stimulation of urination and defecation, again, it's all about the processing of digestion, and sexual arousal. This concludes our overall lecture of the spinal nerves as well as the reflex arc.